Well, here we go. Again. On Monday, Donald Trump will place his hand upon a Bible and, if no lightning strike is incoming, recite the presidential oath of office. When the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court shakes his hand, Donald Trump will become only the second man to serve non-consecutive terms as president and the first convicted criminal to inhabit the White House. He will not, on this occasion, stand on one of the balconies of the Capitol building, face the mall and address a crowd smaller than he will later claim it was. As of this recording, the plan was to defer to a brutal DC cold snap and conduct proceedings under the rotunda roof. It will be, if you will, an inauguration. Here all week, etc. The first time Trump was sworn in 8 years ago, it was possible to regard Trump's election as a glitch, an aberration, or a novelty, or perhaps to loftily harumph that 63 million Americans had simply not considered the downsides of electing to Earth's most powerful office someone of Trump's meagre qualifications and abundant apparent disqualifications. 4 years ago, even if 74 million Americans did vote to extend Trump's stint, it was possible to sigh, well, at least that's all over, back to normal, and so forth, especially after Trump's efforts to overturn the result of the 2020 election by subterfuge and violence. This time, no such consolations are available to those who may have yearned for them. What turned out to be a conclusive plurality of 77 million Americans who cannot by now have been in much doubt about who and what they were voting for, wanted Donald Trump back. They have him, as does the world, for 4 more years, though it seems a reasonable bet that the wisdom of abolishing the 22nd Amendment will become a Trump world talking point circa 2027. How will Trump's second administration differ from his first? What will Trump's second inaugural address portend for America and the world? And what makes a great, and not great, inaugural speech? This is the Foreign Desk.
You know, this is probably the most dangerous thing that the United States Senate's done in a long time.
Fear normally tends not to be a great foreign policy advisor. And so the fear that this is generating is leading to a sort of mix of denial and subservience.
America's constantly having new dawns. This is a kind of running theme of these presidencies.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. By way of preamble to Monday's proceedings, we have been treated this week to the Senate confirmation hearings of some of the people President-elect Trump has nominated for his cabinet. I'm joined first of all by Tom Nichols, staff writer for The Atlantic and author most recently of Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Tom, welcome back to the show. Are you anticipating a notably different administration from the first Trump one?
Absolutely. One thing that's been common among all of these nominees has been that they have been very careful not to get sideways with Trump in anything they say. You had the Attorney General nominee, Pam Bondi, saying that she would really have to study the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship before she could answer a question about it. You know, that's ridiculous. That was a way of saying, look, I know the right answer. Birthright citizenship is part of the 14th Amendment, but I don't want to say that out loud. So you had a lot of that going on in these nominations. The worst hearing so far, of course, has been the one for Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, which was almost entirely content-free. I mean, really no questions about the future of American defense or American national security. So it's going to be a very different cabinet. It's going to be people who would have been considered fourth and fifth string level nominees. Again, with the exception of Marco Rubio, who I think would have been a credible Secretary of State in any Republican administration. But the rest of them are, you know, there's not going to be, to use this hackneyed phrase, there aren't going to be a lot of adults in the room.
Well, if we continue with the specific instance of Pete Hegseth, and you're right, his confirmation hearing has not been a great moment in American public discourse. Assuming he does, however, and despite everything, get the keys to the Pentagon, how much damage is he actually capable of doing?
A tremendous amount of damage. First, he can make policy and changes about personnel that could affect the well-being of, 1 million people in the military. The Pentagon is 3 million people. That if I say this as a former Defense Department employee. I was a professor at the Naval War College for 25 years, and I was a DoD employee. He's made it clear that he really has no idea what he's doing other than to conduct a culture war in the Pentagon. The other place where he can do a lot of damage is, the actual security of the United States of America. If there's a crisis, if there's some kind of military confrontation, this guy is supposed to be the chief advisor to the president of the United States on these matters, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the National Security Council and the Secretary of State. I mean, I think the people that I know from the national security community, that's the part where they get sweaty, where they say, it's bad enough that he could just mismanage the Pentagon into the ground until he's fired by tweet one day. In the meantime, there could be some unforeseen circumstance that could lead the United States into an incredibly complicated and dangerous crisis for which he has no background, experience, qualifications, nothing. I'm sorry, being a major in the National Guard isn't enough.
And yet, at least judging by orthodox strictures, he's not the least controversial choice among people who will play a role in protecting the United States national security. Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, I know was the nomination that really did send people's eyebrows ascending into their hairlines.
Well, because they have concerns about Tulsi Gabbard's views and her coziness with people who are enemies of the United States, including the now deposed Bashar Assad and, of course, Vladimir Putin. Again, I say this as a former holder of a security clearance. To put someone at the top of the intelligence community who likely would have had a really hard time getting even a middling level clearance is really an astonishing thing. I would still say that Hegseth, even though he looks like he's headed toward confirmation, if you watched his hearing, I think you saw people, except for, again, the most MAGA senators who were putting on a brave face. I think you saw everybody kind of with this queasy look of saying, wow, this is going to happen. And, this is probably the most dangerous thing the United States Senate's done in a long time. I think he's less controversial in his views than Tulsi Gabbard, but he's equally unqualified. And truthfully, Secretary of Defense is a much more substantive position than Director of National Intelligence.
I mean, you're quite right, I think, judging on past form to suggest that quite a few of these people, even if they do get confirmed, are likely to get fired in fairly short order on the whims of their president. But they will, at least some of his nominees will make up the next administration of the United States. They will have that first 100 days in which the American punditocracy sets such great store. Let's start with the pessimism first, I guess, before moving on to the optimism. In that 100 days, what's the worst that could happen?
War. It's always the worst that can happen in the first 100 days of a president's administration, a major national security issue. I don't think that's especially likely unless Trump, as he sometimes does, picks up the phone and says, we're going to kill so-and-so. I mean, remember, this is the president who picked up the phone to Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and said, we're going to take out Assad. And Mattis said, yes, sir, we'll get right on that. And then he hung up the phone and basically said, we're not going to do that. You're not going to have someone now who's going to hang up the phone and say, we're not going to do that. There are no more guardrails on Donald Trump, at least not within the executive branch. I mean, the more likely problem, I think, for that first 100 days is that Donald Trump really decides that he has to make good on all the dumb stuff he said about tariffs and, slaps 25% tariffs on Canada, and he tries to start a trade war with Denmark over Greenland and gets into some kind of Donnybrook with the Chinese. I think the other thing you must expect to see, and I'd be surprised if it doesn't happen, is that this is not a team of rivals. This is a team of bitter enemies. And so the fighting and the infighting, I mean, if you thought it was bad in the first Trump administration, just wait for this one, because even someone as formidable as Susie Wiles, who's going to be the new White House chief of staff. This is going to be a pretty fractious group. And I think with that much chaos and indecision and infighting, we're in for a rocky 3 months.
I mean, just finally then, and depending on, of course, on how you look at these things, your suggestion that they may descend fairly swiftly into an impression of cats in a sack might be the optimistic analysis. But beyond that, is there any prospect, do you think, even by accident, that the first 100 days of Trump 2.0 might have some productive consequence, deliver on at least something that the 77.3 million of your fellow citizens who voted for him hoped they were getting?
Well, the problem, Andrew, is that he never really put forward a lot of policies. For the past year and a half, I've been banging this drum that Democrats, thinking that this was a policy argument, just didn't understand the election. What those 77 million people voted for were, some of them, I think, genuinely believe that Joe Biden was responsible for inflation and that if they vote for Donald Trump, they're going to get cheaper eggs. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Donald Trump is desperately trying to backpedal that now, saying, it's complicated. Because as is typical of Donald Trump, he said a lot of wild stuff on the campaign trail that couldn't possibly be implemented now. He cannot make eggs be cheaper in, February. It's not going to happen. So the question is, what policy priority does he have in that first 100 days? I think what you're really going to see, and what he really ran on, and what many other people supported him to do, was he ran on a campaign of vindication, that is to stay out of jail, stay out of federal court, and vengeance. And what you're going to see, and it's already begun with the firing of Mike Turner from the Intelligence Committee in the U.S. House, what you're going to see is a lot of people getting fired and moved out, and all of these Trump appointees creating their own little fiefdoms and getting jobs for loyalists. And so I don't think it's impossible there could be some sort of legislative agenda in the first 100 days. I just don't know what it is, perhaps other than to somehow undermine Ukraine or impose some tariffs and start a trade war. But if you're asking me what policies Trump wants to put in the first 100 days, I would ask, what did he say on the campaign trail that's actually actionable in the first 100 days? There was nothing. I mean, his campaign stops were literally incoherent. So, I'm not being facetious. I genuinely don't know what it is he wants to do other than get even with his enemies, start a trade war, and stick it to the Ukrainians.
Tom Nichols, thanks for joining us. That was Tom Nichols, staff writer for The Atlantic. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. Though it is only Americans who get to elect a US president, the rest of us have to live with their choice. The world has had one experience of Donald Trump's idea of global leadership. Did we learn anything from it that might brace us for the second? Well, I'm joined now by Nathalie Tocci, Director of the International Affairs Institute and former advisor to 2 EU High Representatives for Foreign Affairs. Nathalie, even before he takes office this week, Donald Trump has been claiming credit for the ceasefire in the Middle East. Does he deserve any?
Well, he obviously doesn't deserve credit for the actual content of the deal. It's clear that if you look at the text of the agreement, it's pretty much the same text that has been floating around since May. So it's very much the product of the Biden administration. However, politically, I actually do think that there's something to his words insofar as it's fairly clear that actually the main player that really turned around on this one is actually Benjamin Netanyahu. And so whereas, of course, there are good relations between, sort of Trump world and, the Israeli government, because Trump is kind of known for being somewhat unpredictable, I think, Netanyahu probably wants to make sure that he actually has some brownie points to spend with Trump. And so giving him essentially a kind of prize, a welcome prize, for the beginning of his presidency is probably something that Netanyahu wanted to do. So in a political sense, perhaps less than a policy sense, I actually do think that there's something to be said.
If this is, as you suggest, sort of a present to Donald Trump from Benjamin Netanyahu, does that tell us that the rest of the world did learn something from Trump's first term about how to approach him and how to get things done from a foreign policy perspective?
I think that's probably right. But I think speaking to the broader point, the lesson indeed that many foreign leaders have kind of drawn from Trump is that this is a fairly narcissistic person, and so they probably think and hope. It doesn't necessarily mean that it ends up being effective, but they probably think and hope that by somehow massaging his ego, they can actually get business done.
Nevertheless, do you feel like that there is a consensus among other leaders, possibly even a trepidation among other leaders that this term will be different, that whatever we think we may have learned about Donald Trump as a foreign policy player the first time round might not necessarily apply this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, particularly as far as partners and allies are concerned. I actually think that there's also a difference between not just Trump 1 and Trump 2, but Trump 2 in election campaign mode and Trump 2 as president-elect and perhaps president. During the election campaign, the impression that we had was of a kind of fairly isolationist, indeed transactional, but relatively isolationist understanding of MAGA. I think what we're beginning to see, and of course at the moment it's only words, let's see if it actually plays out into more than words, is that this is a more revisionist, perhaps imperialistic version of Trump. And the way in which essentially the main targets of his words so far have been allies rather than theoretically adversaries like Russia and China. So I think that the trepidation and perhaps even slightly the panic is very dominant in Europe, in Canada, in Mexico, less so in other parts of the world. Not only the China and Russias of this world that will probably look at Trump with, including China, perhaps even with some degree of hope, but also I think in the Indias or the South Africas of this world that may not necessarily mind an expansionist even United States because it doesn't really have to do with them much and they just think they can do business with Trump.
Well, on the subject of those imperialist, expansionist instincts, I mean, among America's allies, theoretical allies, it will probably be causing the most current angst in Denmark, which is, of course, a founder member of NATO, and yet whose territory has been explicitly threatened by Donald Trump. Do European leaders yet understand how seriously they're supposed to take any of Trump's more outre pronouncements?
Well, I mean, I think fear normally tends not to be a great foreign policy advisor. And so the fear that this is generating is leading to a sort of mix of denial and subservience, basically. You have quite a bit of denial going on, essentially saying, but, you don't really have to listen to his words and just look at his actions and it's just words. And I actually fear that it's delusional. Now, I don't think that we're going to see necessarily US troops marching into Greenland, but I do think that we're going to see quite a bit of economic and perhaps even military coercion going on vis-a-vis allies. So I think there's an element of denial there. And I think the second instinct, again, very much a product of the fear and the panic, is that of trying to please Trump in every possible way. Also, simply take the case of Denmark. And of course, it's not the first time that Trump talks about Greenland. But whereas in Trump 1, the Danish reaction was really rather scathing towards Trump, now it seems to be far more subservient, start trying to say, well, there may be some US interests and we're happy to talk about it. And I'm just not sure that that's the kind of attitude that actually generates much respect in Trump world.
Well, just before we move off Europe, though, obviously the one thing, apart from the prospect of the conquest of Greenland, that European leaders will be looking towards is Trump's attitude towards Ukraine, this war he's famously said he could stop in a day. Are we yet clear, or is anybody yet clear, on whether Trump's return to the White House is likelier to be good or bad news for Ukraine?
So, firstly, I would say that at least if we want to look at some positives, at least what we can point to is that there seems to be a recognition by Trump that indeed the war is not going to end in a day. And I think underlying that recognition is the appreciation that the war's not going to end in a day because Putin doesn't want to end it in a day. So whereas during the election campaign, I think the assumption was the war is going on because Ukraine is being too intransigent and all we need to do is a little bit of arm twisting and they will come to their senses. It seems to me that underlying the recognition that this may take longer is finally the understanding that, the problem's on the other side, right? Now, it still, I think, leaves wide open the question of what is actually going to happen if a deal is not reached, even if it's not reached because Russia doesn't want it. There seems to be a hope certainly in Ukraine and perhaps in other quarters in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe and Eastern Europe, that Trump is going to therefore get very angry with Putin and double down in support for Ukraine. I fear that that is delusional. And so I think that there's a very realistic prospect that indeed the negotiations drag out, that there is not going to be an agreement. And that even if it will be fairly obvious that there is no agreement because Russia doesn't want it, Trump will get kind of bored with Ukraine and will start looking for his Nobel Peace Prize elsewhere. And that will basically leave the onus of Ukrainian security on European shoulders entirely.
It's very easily just finally to imagine Trump going looking for a Nobel Peace Prize, either another go at North Korea or some sort of outreach to Iran. But let's leave the big one till last, which is China. Do we get the impression the Chinese are proceeding on the assumption that all his promises about taxing Chinese goods at 100% or whatever it is are probably not going to survive contact with reality once Trump's voters start realizing how much more expensive everything has just become?
I mean, I think, from the conversations I have had with, some Chinese experts and officials, my sense is that what they think is that they have quite a few things to potentially offer Trump. So obviously there's something they can do on trade. There is something that they can offer on investment. They can possibly buy more American LNG. They can help constrain the Iranian nuclear program. And perhaps they can even do something to sort of, bring Russia to its senses. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think the point here is that they think they have quite a few chips to play with. And even if they are probably skeptical that this is going to lead to some sort of grand bargain with Trump, they probably think that they have enough to play with to contain some of the damage that Trump can do towards them.
Nathalie, thanks for joining us. That was Nathalie Tocci, Director of the International Affairs Institute. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller, and finally to the theory and practice of the inaugural speech itself. It's actually pretty easy to avoid giving the worst inaugural speech ever. That title is surely held, surely for all time, by William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, who in 1841 intoned fully 8,500 agonizingly tedious words over 2 interminable hours of a freezing DC afternoon without wearing either hat or coat. Legend identifies this folly as the cause of the pneumonia which killed him a month later. But what is the secret to an actually good inaugural speech? Well, joining me now is Alex von Tunzelmann, the historian, author and screenwriter. And Alex, let's start with one of the greatest hits.
I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
So, Alex, that line, I mean, it's a snappy bit of copywriting, obviously, but why do you think that one has endured? What landed about that?
Well, that, of course, was John F. Kennedy in 1961. And it was a moment of, even though actually there was quite a lot of dispute over Kennedy's election itself, what he was trying to establish there was, you know, the new brave United States going into the 1960s, a new era of renewal after the war and so on, and, you know, creating a new country, a new culture. So, yes, it's obviously a very well-written, memorable line. And what you'll find is a lot of these speeches use this rhetorical technique where they do a bit of a reversal. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, switching that line around. And so the idea there really is we're all in it together, pulling it together and kind of, you know, uniting America. And also, you know, as you heard at the beginning of the clip, a very strong statement of American power in the world, which, of course, would be a huge theme of his presidency, and little did he know quite how much a theme at this point. But the idea that you have this kind of, you know, America as a light on a hill is that thing of America with this glow from the fire. Enjoyed his Massachusetts accent there. The glow from that fire can truly light the world. You know, the idea that America really is in a position of global leadership at this point, with the British Empire, of course, having fallen well into abeyance.
Well, let's move along to what is probably the other most famous zinger in the inaugural canon. This, going back to 1933, is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Well, 6 years or so later, the world would learn that they actually had a fair bit more to fear than that. But again, Roosevelt, that's another call to action. It's another appeal to America's sense of itself.
Absolutely. And another neat little rhetorical reversal. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And yes, this was, again, the idea, and you will see this idea a lot. America's constantly having new dawns. This is a kind of running theme of these presidencies. And yeah, the idea is, again, a great national renewal. Again, you have to think this is kind of after the Depression, coming out of that into the New Deal, this quite new world. And the idea of doing something quite different. It's a very bold speech. And of course, Roosevelt would stay in office really until the end of the war. This was kind of a new era in America. So it's a very bold speech. It's kind of fascinating going back there. And of course, you rightly say that 6 years later, the world kind of fell into war. I mean, arguably even before then, really. But even in 1933, it was pretty obvious that the direction of travel, certainly in Europe, was becoming quite alarming. So there was enough to talk about here. So when he's saying the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, you could read that as a bit of a comment on that international situation, as well as the domestic one.
Well, that's why I wanted to bring in the next clip. And this is Ronald Reagan in 1981. He is remembered as a great communicator. He was also very much one of your New Dawn for America enthusiasts. It's morning in America, in fact, was his slogan, possibly in this election or the one after, I forget which. But this quote, I think, is interesting because it is actually quite downbeat. It's quite pessimistic, and it sort of sets the tone for the trajectory, I think at least, on which the Republican Party would embark over the next 43 years and counting. This is Reagan.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
And that's another nice little piece of rhetorical jiu-jitsu. You get the sense there the crowd aren't quite sure whether they're supposed to applaud.
Do you know, I found that so interesting when I re-listened to this. I'd forgotten there's such a pause before people start applauding after that line. And is that, I wonder, because it takes a minute to take it in and appreciate the reversal? Or is it, as you say, a sort of response to the negativity of it? Because it's a surprisingly negative line. It's identifying that America is in crisis and has a problem. I mean, these things are quite negative points to make. This is not saying, how wonderful it is, the doors are open. It's saying that we've got a big problem ahead of us and we need to solve it. And the problem, as he identified it, was government. And I agree with you. I think that really marks a kind of really significant change of direction and tone in right-wing politics in the US.
Well, at this point, I want to go back a decent stretch and introduce what is, I'll be honest, a personal favourite. I've always had an amount of sympathy for President Ulysses S. Grant. That's largely because I'm a huge fan of his memoir, published by Mark Twain, in which he spends very little time discussing or reflecting on the fact that he was actually president for 8 years, because as he demonstrates, or as he makes perfectly clear in his second inaugural in 1873, he absolutely hated the job and couldn't wait to be shot of it.
This I promise, looking forward with the greatest anxiety to the day when I shall be released from responsibilities that at times are almost overwhelming, and from which I have scarcely had a respite since the eventful firing upon Fort Sumter in April 1861 to the present day. My services were then tendered and accepted under the first call for troops growing out of that event. I did not ask for place or position, and was entirely without influence or the acquaintance of persons of influence, but was resolved to perform my part in a struggle threatening the very existence of the nation. I performed a conscientious duty without asking promotion or command, and without a revengeful feeling towards any section or individual. Notwithstanding this, throughout the war and from my candidacy for my present office in 1868 to the close of the last presidential campaign, I have been the subject of abuse and slander scarcely ever equaled in political history, which today I feel that I can afford to disregard in view of your verdict, which I gratefully accept as my vindication.
Those are not the words there, Alex, of a man intending to stand for public office again.
I mean, it's quite an extraordinary speech, isn't it? I mean, basically sort of, summing up this section as, I'm great, you all suck, stop being so mean about me, I'm here, sucks to be you. I mean, it's this very sort of triumphant, but hugely wounded speech. And this is what I mean about the sort of settling of grievances. He's up there complaining about the kind of slander he thinks he's received, which is the worst ever, he says. I mean, if only he'd lived till today, imagine his head would explode. But, it's the sort of very defensive, quite extraordinary piece of speech making, not remotely inspiring, and all about himself.
Well, which may remind listeners of a certain other president who has not shied away from either transports of abject self-pity or making everything about himself, specifically this guy.
2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens. But for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities. Rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. And the crime and the gangs and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Donald Trump's first inaugural, obviously. Now, we know he didn't write that himself, largely because he doesn't start rambling about water pressures in the middle of it. But if we leave aside the figure delivering the speech, what do we actually make of that as a piece of political speech making?
Well, once again, it's really quite negative. The words you take away from it are American carnage, which is kind of a very strange takeaway to give people, because obviously in context, what he means is that American carnage is what's been happening. He's going to solve that. That stops today. But because those words are the ones you remember, what you're thinking about is American carnage. And I kind of wonder if that's actually rather counterproductive to his aims, if those are the words we then associate with him. And it's kind of very interesting. I mean, to talk about the figure delivering it, yes, he's nothing like as good a speech maker reading things out as obviously, he is, even for his critics, must admit, quite charismatic, making speeches off the cuff. He can be very lively, whereas he's quite deadened. But yeah, it's a strange clip, that. And I think usually as a political speechwriter, that the words people take away, they're the ones that will stick in their heads. So you would try to avoid these negative terms like American carnage, because then people just think American carnage, that is what Donald Trump does, rather than remembering that actually he's critiquing that, because those words are so memorable when put together.
Alex von Tunzelmann, thank you as always for joining us. That was Alex von Tunzelmann, the historian, author and screenwriter. This is The Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. Thanks also this week to Chris Chermak as President Ulysses S. Grant. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.